Welcome, everyone, to the Branching Minds 2023 Virtual MTSS Summit. My name is Maya Gatt, and I'm the CEO and co-founder at Branching Minds, and we are thrilled that over 1,200 educators from across the world could join us today today and tomorrow for 2 days of professional learning focused on empowering educators, streamlining systems, and supporting students. We know your schedules are extremely busy, and all of us at Branching Minds are incredibly grateful that you have carved out time to learn with and from us over the next 2 days. Now, we have a pretty packed agenda, and I want to thank all of the speakers and presenters from districts and organizations across the country who are going to share their insights and facilitate conversations and help advance MTSS for everyone here today, myself included, and for our entire MTSS community writ large. I also wanted to give a special shout out to the folks at Medina City Schools in Ohio, who won our Summit Watch Party contest and is connecting today with a ton of their team members. You all are amazing Branching Minds champions, and we're super grateful for your enthusiasm and partnership. So we hope you get what you want today from this work. Now, to kick off our amazing agenda for the next 2 days, it is my sincere pleasure to welcome our opening keynote speaker, AJ Krappel. So I was lucky enough to get introduced to AJ in the strangest of ways, through a friend of a friend of a friend of a non-friend of a non-friend of a non-friend who knew that both of us cared deeply about educational equity and thought that was enough to forge a friendship. They were right. We scheduled a 30-minute virtual coffee just to meet each other, blew through 30 minutes, spoke for an hour, scheduled another hour, and I gotta tell you, I just can't get enough of AJ. He is a powerhouse. He thinks deeply about the box. He thinks deeply about the world outside of the box. And he thinks creatively and passionately about how to solution towards a better world that doesn't have boxes, all in the name of, again, educational equity. And I'm regularly inspired by almost everything that comes out of his mouth. And so you all are in for a real treat. Sorry, AJ, to set the bar so high, but I know you will deliver. AJ currently serves as a conservator at DeSoto ISD in Texas and has previously served as deputy commissioner at the Texas Education Agency. He's also spearheaded reforms as board chair of Kansas City, Missouri Public Schools. And he also recently wrote a book called Great on Their Behalf, Why School Boards Fail, How Yours Can Become Effective. He's a man on a mission and is tackling this work from a lot of different dimensions. Earlier this year, I asked AJ to join our podcast, Schooling Around, which you should listen to if you haven't. He does a great job there, where he discussed his work with student-led restorative practices and his belief that school transformation begins with adults, aka us, all of you. So that is the topic that he will dig into further with you today. If you have thoughts or questions for AJ, please put them in the chat and he will respond to them as he's able throughout his keynote and during a Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming my friend, AJ.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the entire Branching Minds team. It's a real joy to get to be with you all during this time. I want to share with you all a few ideas about how I, as a leader, and whatever my leadership context is, can be really powerful in the work that I'm doing with students. I want to walk through a framework that I use in my own life for helping drive transformative action. And then I would just want to open the conversation for Q&A. I'll be using, in large part, as the conversation topic, a lot of the work that I've done with school systems across the country around student-led restorative practices, but that is a means to a larger end, which is to just constantly create opportunities to reflect on who am I being and who do I need to become such that I can have the biggest impact on being transformed in the lives of the students I serve. All that to say is you have questions. I want this to be as interactive as possible. I'm going to be asking you questions, so stay close to the chat box. I'll be watching the chat box. I've got it up right here. Be looking for live comments as we go through this. And just excited to be engaged with you all today. I was leaving from work to drive home, and as I pulled up to my house, I took a moment to reflect, and I realized I absolutely no recollection of the journey whatsoever. Has anybody out there had that experience? Feel free to mention in the chat box. Have you ever had this experience of driving from work, arriving at home, and suddenly realizing you have no recollection of the journey whatsoever? And this is no simple journey either. There it involves starting and stopping, turning left, turning right, speeding up, slowing down, merging into freeway speed traffic, presumably stopping at stoplights. I don't know. I wasn't there. But I wasn't present to my driving at all. In the moments when I'm not present to my driving, drop it in the chat box. What was operating the vehicle in those moments? In the moments when I'm not present to my driving, what was operating the vehicle? Take a moment and reflect as you think back. In these moments, I wasn't present to my driving. All these complicated activities of driving took place, and I just wasn't present for them. I was off someplace else entirely. In the moment I wasn't present in my driving, what was driving the car? I see people putting all kinds of different ideas. Yeah, is it autopilot? Yeah, is it muscle memory? Is it maybe is it a sense of routine? Maybe I have one of these fancy cars that drove itself. I don't know what the deal is, but I wasn't present. It wasn't me. What I invite you to consider is that as leaders, often we can show up in one of two modes. That we can show up present, and in that moment we're fully alive, fully awake, fully available in the moment, and in the space of presence, my choices give rise to what happens next. My choices create the future. I love highway hypnosis. I'm loving that, Noemi. But in addition to being present, the other way that I could show up is I could show up patterned. That there is a predefined system that's been designed in my own mind of exactly what will happen, and I simply execute that pattern again, and I reach a place of automaticity where I can execute the pattern, and it doesn't actually even require me to be present to do so. Such are the nature of patterns that they can literally drive a car all the way across the county, merging into traffic, doing all these things, and me never actually have to be present for any moment of it. What I want you to consider is that this isn't like a good thing, bad thing, right thing, wrong thing. Like, it's not like presence is good and patterns are bad. That's not the conversation here. But it is to reflect on that there's a difference in what's possible in the moments when I'm present, the moments when I'm patterned. Think about it like breathing. Like in the moments when I'm not present to breathing, what happens? In the moments when I'm not present to breathing, what happens? And notably, you're starting to realize, no, it's not that I die. I don't asphyxiate because I wasn't present to my breathing. In the moments that I stop being present to breathing, the pattern for breathing reasserts itself, and the pattern of breathing keeps that going. And I got to tell you, folks, I'm a huge fan of this particular pattern. I love that I don't pass out every time I stop thinking about breathing for a few moments. The pattern of breathing reasserts itself. And in that moment, the pattern of breathing is creating the future of breathing. But in the moment when I'm present to breathing, in the moment when I'm really present to what am I doing with drawing in breath? What am I doing with exhaling breath? In the moment when I'm present to breathing, something becomes available that wasn't available in the moments when I'm not present to my breathing. And that something is choice. In the moments when I'm fully present to my breathing, I choose the future of breathing. I can take really deep breaths. I can take shallow breaths. In the moments when I'm present to breathing, my choices give rise to the future of breathing. There are moments where I can be present, and there are moments where I can be patterned. And we'll give it about, I'd say, 45 seconds or so, and all of us will stop being present to our breathing again. And we won't pass out at the keyboard. Instead, what will happen is that the pattern for breathing will reassert itself. I share this to suggest that my lack of presence doesn't just live in my driving. It lives in a lot of other areas of my life as well. It lives in my breathing. Begin to reflect on where else are you noticing that there are patterns in my life that could absolutely be running my life. Certainly patterns can be running my driving. Certainly patterns can be running my breathing. Drop it in the chat box. What else are you seeing as you begin to reflect on this idea that there are moments in life where the pattern is running the show, where the pattern is creating the future of my life, rather than me being fully present, fully alive, awake, available in the moment, and my choices giving rise to what's happening in the next moment. What are other examples in life where the pattern is running the show? As you begin to reflect on this, notice this shows up all over the place. There's a pattern of when I'm driving, the pattern when I'm breathing, maybe the pattern of starting my day, maybe the pattern of who I'm interacting with, maybe the pattern of when I go to school or when I go to work or when I go to church, when I go to neighborhood associations. Begin to notice all the areas in my life. Oh, Tracy, I love it. The pattern of reading, where I've read the same thing. I have read it without reading, and I get to the end of the page. I'm like, I have no recollection of what I just read. Eating, Renee, that's so spot on. Is that I can get into this habituated way of eating, and in ways that work, that are creating the future I want, but that works out great. But in ways that aren't creating the future, where I'm in a pattern of eating things that aren't really the life-sustaining substance that I need. Like, it's patterns that aren't actually creating the future I want. And so it's not that presence is good and patterns, are bad. It's that there are some patterns that are creating the future I want. And the doom scrolling on social media, no doubt. There's some patterns that aren't creating the future that I want. And if I want to cause transformation, presence is required for that. It is not that one is right or wrong, but if I want to actually have a say in what happens going forward, I'd have to actually be present for that. The patterns will never take me to someplace new. That instead, it'll be just like with my driving, that I'll pull up in the driveway of my home having no recollection of how I got here. No recollection whatsoever. Such is the nature of presence and patterns. As we reflect on this idea of presence and patterns, I want to use that to merge into this conversation I want to share with you today about transformative action. And what is it that I try to do in my life to really bring forward a space of transformative action where my choices, my intentions give rise to the impact that I intend. What I want to offer you is 3 steps that I take in my own life to try to ground myself in the work necessary to create transformative action, actions that actually allow me to give rise to something new. The first step in that is something I refer to as awareness. And the idea of awareness is that I'm getting present to the patterns in my school and the future those patterns are creating. This is the idea of awareness, where I'm looking around me and I'm seeing, often for the very first time, what is taking place in the world around me. I'll give you 2 distinct examples this whole way through. The first is an example I describe is a pattern of sexism in my life. As I reflect back, I remember the first time that I can recall noticing that the girls in my school were being treated very differently than the boys in my school. I was in 7th grade. I thought I was a super hot shot. I was trying to be on the basketball team. So the first pep rally comes along and they introduce the boys team and the boys come running out. Everybody's going wild in the crowds. People are cheering the boys. And be mindful, this is 7th grade boys basketball. The team's not even good at this point, but everybody is screaming and yay, wonderful, wonderful. And then they call the girls team to have them run out. Now, the girls team actually won the vast majority of the games in the previous season. It's just been a really stellar powerhouse. The girls basketball team is actually quite competent relative to their peers at other schools, whereas the boys is not. But when the girls team came out into that pep rally, what were they met with? Near silence. And though I didn't have the language to clarify it, I didn't have the language to really articulate or understand what was happening in the moment, it was the very first time that I fully recall that the girls' team at my school is valued as less than the boys' team at my school. And I couldn't put the pieces together. I couldn't quite formulate it. Why? Like, what's happening here? Like, and so I didn't have the language for it. But even at that point in my life, in my spirit, it was clear to me that something is wrong here. And some of you are probably also noticing, like, AJ, what are you talking about? The first time you noticed this was in seventh grade? Yeah, think that through. That in itself suggests that what is going on in our society, that I didn't gain an awareness of this phenomenon until literally the seventh grade, when I really began to have just this real cognition, this understanding that the girls in my school are valued less than the boys in my school. This is a moment of awareness. I want you to take a moment and reflect on what's a moment of awareness for me? What was a moment for the first time that I began to notice patterns in my school, and the future those patterns are creating? Another way of thinking about this is, I remember I taught computer programming to middle schoolers. So I don't know if there are any middle school weirdos out there joining us today. Like, if you like awkward children, I'm with you on that one. But I remember there was this time I was in the lunchroom, and you ever get that spidey sense where you know something that ain't supposed to happen is about to happen. And I turn around just in time to intervene, where this seventh grader decides he's going to jump over, hey, Chelsea, he's going to jump over the table in the lunchroom and try to bring his fist out or something on this kid on the other side of the table. Like, I don't know what was happening here. But I immediately got there in time, and I grabbed both of them, held them apart, prevented them from getting into this fight. And I remember asking, like, what are you thinking? What is wrong with you? Like, this is not how you solve problems. In that moment, I had this real awareness, that these children are behaving this way. They have no clarity, no sense about how to actually solve a conflict. Like, why can't you two solve conflicts in some way other than trying to do flying punches over the lunchroom table? This doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It was a moment of awareness. I began to see patterns in my school. In the future, those patterns of behavior were giving rise to. This is the first step in transformative action, is I begin to see things that I just hadn't seen before. I gain an awareness of things. And inside of that awareness, I begin to understand the connection between the pattern and the future, the inevitable future born out of the pattern that I'm witnessing. Awareness is necessary. It's a step in the direction of transformative action. But awareness, while necessary, is insufficient. Because awareness has me seeing what's happening in the world around me. And in the future, the behaviors in the world around me are creating. This is necessary but insufficient. The next step in transformative action I refer to as acknowledgement, where awareness is seeing what's happening out there in the world around me. Acknowledgement is getting present to the patterns in my own life and the future those patterns are creating, beginning to notice what are the things that I'm doing, how am I showing up, and what is that causing? In the world of sexism, I remember my freshman year, I so badly wanted to fit in with the cool kids. So I'm outside of the gym locker room. I'm with the big kids who are headed off to the football practice. And I see a group of the guys, and they are whistling at and speaking disrespectfully to this young lady walking past. And in my spirit, it is clear to me that this is not behavior that's appropriate. It's not behavior that's respectful. This isn't how this young lady should be treated. But it's not that I didn't interrupt it. I didn't even walk away. Guess what I did? I joined in. And it was only moments later, after having participated in this behavior, that I reflected and realized this is a pattern of behavior that I've fallen into, of treating young women in disrespectful manners as a way of trying to fit in with the people around me. And that the existence of sexism, the existence of oppression targeted, like that, I'm actually causing that. This is no longer a seventh grade situation where I'm completely clueless. I'm actually a co-author of the very thing that in my spirit, I've already determined isn't what I want to see in the world at all. This is a moment of acknowledgement. When I get clear about the pattern in my life and the future that pattern is causing, that the very things that I say that I don't want to see in the world, the moment of acknowledgement, I get clear about how I'm creating that very same thing. This is true also in my discipline example. as I begin to reflect, I remember a time when I was working with a group of underclassmen, freshmen, sophomores, and their ability to really negotiate conflict was not what I wanted it to be. And I was constantly trying to facilitate conflict between these students. And in a moment of lucidity, it became clear to me, wait a minute, they lack the tools to really negotiate this conflict because I haven't taught them the tools to negotiate this conflict. It's not merely that I am aware that they don't have these tools. In a moment of clarity, I suddenly had this acknowledgement moment where I realized I'm actually perpetuating the reality where they don't have these tools because I'm not actually doing the work to teach it to them. It's not merely awareness where I see what's happening out there. Now, in a moment of acknowledgement, I get, here's what I'm doing that's contributing to this issue. I keep solving problems for teenagers rather than helping teenagers have the tools to resolve conflict in their own lives. And so the inevitable repercussion of that is the next time they have a problem, what are they going to have to do? They're going to have to come back to the source. I'm going to have to solve it for them. I'm going to have to work through that for them. This isn't actually creating at all the culture that I want in my school, and it's certainly not creating the sense of autonomy and agency and potency in their own life that I want for my students. But in that moment where I am doing for them rather than teaching them how to do for themselves, I'm actually creating the very future that I say I don't want. This is what I mean by acknowledgement. It's a moment when I get present to the patterns in my own life, the way that I'm sleepwalking, sleep driving in my own life, and actually giving rise to the very things that I say that I don't want. This is what I mean in a moment of acknowledgement. That I begin to notice the way that the patterns in my life are actually creating the future that I'm saying I don't want. This is what I mean by acknowledgement. Acknowledgement is absolutely powerful. Sometimes it may reach people in a way that it's accompanied with a sense of mourning, a sense of sadness, a sense of loss of, oh man, there are opportunities. But that's not where I intend for you to take moments of acknowledgement. That acknowledgement isn't about kind of self-flagellation or anything of that. It's about getting clear about what's happening in my life and what are the choices I've been living into. What are the patterns that have been running the show? In a moment of acknowledgement, I'm no longer asleep at the wheel. I'm actually alive, awake, available in the moment, fully present to what's going on, fully present to how can I create the future I want. In the absence of acknowledgement, the inevitable repercussion is I'll wake up in the driveway of my life 20, 30 years from now, having no real presence of how I got here. Such is the nature of patterns. And I'll be aware of what's going on out there, but I want to fully acknowledge what's happening in here. And the future that I'm actively co-creating, I won't even see that that's what I'm doing. I'll just have that awareness to lean on and see what's going on around me. Acknowledgement is absolutely powerful, absolutely a critical step in the direction of transformative action. I love some of the comments that I'm hearing in the sense of urgency on your hearts. If you talk about, here's ways that I have been doing for, rather than trying to be the leader that inspires transformative action and really supporting folks and be able to do for themselves. But acknowledgement is only the second of 3 steps. The third step in transformative action is action, but it's not any type of action. Because at this point, we have 2 different ways that the action could go. We could do action grounded in awareness or action grounded in acknowledgement. Action grounded awareness sounds like, I see what y'all are doing over there and y'all need to stop what you're doing right now. Action grounded in awareness is, I'm noticing that these boys are talking inappropriately and I tell them y'all need to stop. Action grounded in acknowledgement is something else entirely. I'm noticing what I'm doing and I'm taking action to actually rewrite the future of my own behavior. That I'm getting present to the pattern in my life and choosing a new path. Action grounded in awareness often sounds like hypocrisy. I'm telling you to stop doing the very thing that I'm already contributing to, and I'm not even noticing it. Action grounded in acknowledgement paves the path to transformation. And it allows me to then begin to start with my own behaviors and And in the brilliant light of wakefulness, I actually begin to create new choices that give rise to a new future for myself and my school. This is what I mean by action. That in the space of acknowledgement, I create new choices. Those new choices give rise to a new future for myself, my school, and my students. This is what I mean by action. It's not action grounded in awareness. It's action grounded in acknowledgement. What am I doing? What are my behaviors? And how have they been giving rise to it? And in the presence of that, clarified by that acknowledgement, then taking action grounded in that. Here's what I've been doing, and now here's what I can do that is different than what I've been doing. Here is the new future that I can create. This is what I offer you, this idea of transformative action. That first it starts with awareness. Yeah, seeing what's going on in the world around me, and then transitions to acknowledgement. Oh, what is actually happening? How am the patterns of my life perpetuating the very things that I say I don't want? And then moves to acknowledgement. And action grounded in it. Action that says, I'm not going to start by pointing over at what they're doing. I'm going to start by looking at what I'm doing and what is the change I can make in my behavior that can really bring forth something new. Action grounded in acknowledgement, not action grounded in awareness. All this gives rise to the statement that we started with, this idea that I find is inescapable as breathing, that student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change. But there's a completion of this statement, starting with me. It starts with me. That to the extent that there are things that I want my students to know and be able to do, that begins with me. And in the area of sexism, what it means is that as a leader in schools, I've got to constantly be challenging what are systems that are put in place that are disproportionately harming our students who are not male. And what am I doing to dismantle those? And it means in school systems, as a leader, I've got to be looking at what am I doing that is perpetuating the failed systems of discipline that we're engaging in. I want to distinguish as I think about what does action grounded in acknowledgement look like for me from a discipline perspective. I want to distinguish between the idea of restorative practices and retributive practices. Because as I begin to get present to the patterns in my own life, what's inescapable is that I was raised in and surrounded by and completely immersed in a retributive worldview. That the set of patterns that I've learned are grounded in retribution. Who has done wrong, and how do we mete out the appropriate amount of hurtfulness that balances the scales of harm that they have visited on me or someone else? This is the nature of retribution. And you want to be clear. I realize that this doesn't always land for folks well. It's not my intention to be disrespectful, but you want to be clear that what is deep in my heart, so deeply ingrained in the nature of our schools and the nature of our neighborhoods, is a spirit of retribution. That when one of my students violates the rules, that what is important to me and so many other adults is that we want to see punishment. We want to see hurt that matches the hurt that they visited on our community. This is a spirit of retribution, and it is a pattern of behavior that is completely living out its best life in our schools and our neighborhoods all across the country. I want to juxtapose that with the idea of retribution. I believe that actions require consequences, but I don't believe that actions that are inconsistent with our norms and with our rules necessarily require punishment. Consequences and punishment are not the same thing. In a restorative worldview, what happens is when little AJ creates harm, my first question is to get curious about what is the harm that was created. And not only, the obvious harm to the other student, perhaps if little AJ pushed someone, but also the harm to little AJ. And also what's the harm to the learning environment? Now we've got another little kid in the corner who's like, whoa, wait a minute. Now I can't spend all my energy focused on my schoolwork. I got to worry, is little AJ going to push me down? Harm to the learning environment. And so the question becomes, what is all the harm that's been created? And then can we create a context? in which little AJ is prepared to take full responsibility for the harm that he's created and take action that we mutually agree on to repair the harm. That is the action grounded acknowledgement that I've devoted an escalating percentage of my time to, is that what I want for us to do is recognize that all of our students, and I realize this isn't universally true, but I'm going to say it this way nevertheless, that all of our students can be relied upon to make the decision in any situation that makes the best use of the tools that they have in their toolbox. That in any situation, we can reliably expect of our students that they will reach into their toolbox, and whatever is the most appropriate tool to deal with that situation, that's the tool that they're going to grab, and that's the tool that they're going to use. The challenge then is when I see little AJ with a board and a screw, and instead of using a screwdriver, I see him grab a hammer and start beating on that screw with all of the energy he has. My first question shouldn't be, how do we punish him for using a hammer for a screw where a screwdriver is required? My first question should be, why doesn't this brother have a screwdriver? And what is happening in my choices, my adult behaviors that have actually denied him access to screwdrivers? Maybe I have been so busy solving his problems for him that there's literally not a screwdriver in his toolbox. What we can rely on is that our students will consistently, given whatever circumstance they encounter, reach into their toolbox and grab the tool that is the most optimal to address the situation that they're facing. But if they don't have anything other than hammers in the toolbox, then the next time somebody comes and corrects a little AJ, guess which tool he's going to pull? Of course he's going to hammer the situation, because that's the tool that's in the toolbox. That's what he has the most facility with, the most practice with. And until I create the context for him to develop other tools, I shouldn't be surprised that that's the tool he used. But he's not using that tool because it's a tool that he most wants to use. It's the tool that he has access to, is most proficient with. The role of education has got to be to educate. We've got to improve student outcomes. We've got to improve what students know and are able to do. And this idea of student-led restorative practices, what we're suggesting is that instead of the traditional pattern of retribution, not only should we consider a pattern of restoration, but what would it like to have students lead that themselves? What if instead of relying on retribution as our response, and what if instead of relying on me leading a restorative process as a response, what if we train our students to actually themselves lead the restorative process? Right now, I have the benefit to be working with 4 amazing high schools in Ohio, so shout out. And what we are doing, we are a year and a half into a 2-year-long pilot of student-led restorative practices, where the intention is to radically transform the way these schools interact with behavior that's inconsistent with the expectations and consistent with the rules. And the way this works is that when little AJ invariably does what he does, that instead of automatically going to the assistant principal's office, little AJ then instead gets sent to a group of his peers, and they work through a restorative process. And as a result of that, the expectation is that they come up with a restorative plan, an agreement that everyone agrees to, of what little AJ is going to do to restore the harm, to repair the harm over the next 7 days. And at the end of that 7 days, the student who facilitated the circle in the first place will bring everybody back together, figure out, did little AJ honor his word? If so, then we're complete. If not, then there's some other part of the process. But what's really magic about this is not only is little AJ receiving a restorative response rather than a retributive response, but the students who are leading that circle are the ones gaining the bulk of the skills around what does it look like to repair harm? What does it look like to address conflict in society? Those students are never going to have to come back to me. I'm never going to find myself trying to figure out, why don't you have the skills? Because now they do. And what will happen next is some life thing is going to happen. And that student who led that circle last week, now when she reaches into her toolbox, there's going to be a different tool there. With the students I've worked with, many of them, some of the most violent students in the school districts that I've worked in, histories of violence, many of them coming to me with a lovely ankle bracelet provided to them by the county, if you know what I mean. Many of these students have gone through this work of being trained and as students how to lead restorative practices. And in the process of that, now they have new tools so that when the inevitable hardships of life come at them again, they can reach into their toolbox and pull something else out. If I was engaging in action grounded in awareness, what I'd be doing is looking at why aren't these students acting right? What's wrong with these students? And why do I have to keep sorting things out for them every week? Action grounded in acknowledgement allowed me to recognize that what's happening with so many of my students is I haven't taken the step of coming up with a way of ensuring that they have access to these skills for themselves so they can be the architects of their own transformation. I've withheld that from them. Not because I was trying to be malicious, but because I was patterned in my behavior, a pattern that I had been steeped in my entire life, the patterns that had been visited upon me as a child. Now I wake up to notice I'm sitting in the driveway of my life, reproducing the exact same patterns. Such is the nature of this work, that inside of the pattern reproduces what already is. But in the context of presence, that I can begin to see the pattern for what it is and make new choices that give rise to a new future. That if I'm willing to acknowledge my complicit nature and the patterns that have been existing in our schools, then in the space of that presence, new choices give rise to a new future. And then I'm fully living out this ideal that animates so much of my work. The student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change, starting with me. I want to save a little bit of time, as I promised, to go to Q&A. And so I know I've put out a few different ideas around presence and patterns, ideas around awareness, acknowledgement, and action, ideas around restorative versus retributive. I know I've put a number of different ideas out here. And so what I want to do is I want to transition, as I said, to just opening up the floor for whatever questions you might have. As we've been implementing student-led restorative practices around the nation, what is questions around that, but also as we've been doing trainings with teachers and educators around the nation to really explore what's available for them and this transformative action, and where they're really engaging in awareness and acknowledgement and action for themselves and really finding what's possible in my own leadership as an educator. Any questions about any of these things? I certainly want to be responsive to whatever's on your mind.
Well, we've got a couple of questions here. I see that Michelle has asked, what's the first step? Right. Hi, I'm Larissa, by the way, and had the pleasure of talking with AJ on the podcast earlier this year. And I think that this is that's what's on my mind of like, okay, this is a really kind of big thing. It's a big ask. Like, what's the first step?
Yeah, no doubt. Michelle, I appreciate the question. What it suggests is that I'm actively looking for what is the behavior in myself that I can take immediately. And so I'm just loving that energy, loving that vibe altogether. In terms of the first step, right now I told you that I'm in a year and a half 18 months into a 24-month pilot for these 4 high schools to deploy student-led restorative practices. We spent the first 9 months just training adults. Now stop and think that through, because the brother's been talking about student-led restorative practices. Why would I spend the first 9 months only training adults, 9 out of 24 months of a student-led restorative practices initiative? It begins to point in the direction of your inquiry, Michelle, is that my statement is that student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change. I've never seen a student-led restorative practices initiative fall apart because the students were just so poorly behaved that we couldn't make it work. That is not my experience. I've never seen that. Instead, what I've seen is adults really mired in the patterns that we have experienced for ourselves, and maybe the patterns that we're still experiencing. Often I notice that it's almost impossible to expect teachers to create a restorative environment for students if they live in a retributive environment themselves. And so if we can't begin to break the adults out of a culture of retribution, it's just unlikely to expect that we're ever going to be able to consistently create a space for restoration for our students. And so what I would say to you, Michelle, is the first step even if the intention is student-led restorative practice, the first step, even if the intention is to really have this conversation about awareness, acknowledgement, and action-grounded acknowledgement, is the first step is you've got to find some allies and bring them into the work with you. Whether it's folks that you are enjoying this particular session with, or other folks at your school, maybe you're curious about how do we get there. There are some resources about this on my website about student-led restorative practices. It's just studentledrp.org. Yeah, everything on there is free. Whatever would help you, feel free to use it. And maybe use some of the materials there at studentledrp.org to have a conversation with some of the folks in your school. And maybe you all collectively will arrive at, you know what, this is something we want to do. Or maybe you'll uncover a whole lot of deep-seated patterns around retribution that people need to unpack that. Or maybe you'll uncover these systems of trauma that teachers are experiencing right now in their schools that is making it harder for them to be fully available, to be present to the needs of students when I'm struggling to be present in my own circumstances. Or whatever you uncover, that's where you start. That's where you start next, Michelle, is that you work with the adults first. And then once you have a coalition of the willing, then you proceed. A note on that is there are a bunch of high schools in this district. And initially the request was, can you do all the high schools at once? I was like, I absolutely cannot do all the high schools. This is a recipe for fail. I'm not going to participate in your failure in this. I said, instead, let's put out an application and see who the willing are. And so a bunch of the high schools applied. We chose just a few of them, and we chose 5 of them, and then we whittled it down to 4. And so now we've got these 4, but it's 4 who applied. They requested to be part of this process going forward. And so that's critical. Is like, how do we build a coalition of the willing? And so part of it may just be having that conversation with folks, or part of it may be pulling people together and saying who actually desires to be on this journey. Because the challenge with this work, whether we're talking about this pattern of transformative action, or whether we're talking about trying to deploy student-led restorative practices, like in either case, like there's an existing pattern in the school, and we're going to have to confront that and honor it, not crap all over it, and not make it wrong, but recognize it's there, and it's served a purpose for a reason. People put it in place because this is how they saw was the best way to serve children. And now as we know more, we can do more. And so not going in with a holier than thou or righteous spirit about it, but with just a spirit that really wants to open up people to what are the different ways we can serve our students. But that's a conversation with the adults first. And once you have a coalition of the willing with the adults, then you can start to move forward with, okay, now how do we co-create this? This is a heart and mind work. This isn't just, you all will implement this. You can't create liberation, by bonding people to something that they don't believe in. That you really have to create a safe space for people to wrestle with their own transformation. And in the space of that transformation, it begins to open up what's possible for their students next. But having a coalition of the willing with the adults is the first step. Yeah.
Well, so a couple of questions about elementary versus secondary. People are asking, like, is this possible at the elementary level? I think there was one question about, like, is there a different kind of differentiated practice? Have you seen that at work? So maybe talk a little bit about that.
So there are 3 different types of restorative practices that we deploy, and it works on a continuum. So think of a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is completely calm and 10 is completely violent. So we're, from 0, which is, we are prepared to listen and we're open and we're just kind of ready for whatever life has to offer. And 10 being, I am so violently triggered that I'm not even in my forward mind. I'm in this place of kind of flight, fight, or freeze, and fight is currently winning. So we think of the scale from 0 to 10. We offer 3 different restorative practices. The first is community circles. This is just what we do every day as part of school. Like, we come together in community, we check in with each other. Community circles take the form of just a check-in where we literally go around the circle and everybody does some check-in. Often one that I'll commonly do, that I was doing yesterday with a group of educators that I was training, was just go around the circle. What's one word that describes where you're at right now? What's one word that describes kind of what you got or what you've taken away, or kind of what's coming up for you right now in this moment? And we'll just go around the room. That's a community circle. And you do that at the lower end, from 0, 1, 2, 3. You just use community circles, and this should just become a normal part of the fabric of school. We're not waiting for something to happen. This is preventative work. This is building community and connectiveness, because what the evidence is abundantly clear is students that experience a sense of belonging will be more likely to persevere the inevitable challenges of education. If you know that education requires some amount of struggle, say amen. It's not that it's going to be an effort without struggle. It's going to be a question of what are the protective factors we've put in place in our school community when students experience struggle. And community circles are part of that. How do we create a proactive sense of belonging for students? So that's the first of the 3 restorative practices. And again, on our scale of 0 to 10, when we're at 0, 1, 2, 3, we do community circles. But every now and then there's a conflict. When we get into that 4, 5, 6, we haven't necessarily escalated violence yet, but there is definitely a conflict. And the thing to be clear about is conflict is just a natural part of the human experience. If you go be human for more than 5 minutes, you go experience some conflict in your life. And so this is not a negative thing. Conflict is just conflict. And what there is to do is, do I have the tools in my toolbox so that when conflict emerges, then I can navigate that conflict in a way that is really empowering for both of us in the conflict rather than destructive for both of us in the conflict. And so the second tier of restorative practices are mediation circles, that in the space of a conflict where there are these 2 conflictants, that what's happened is that the connection between them has evaporated. And in the space of non-connection, the smallest challenges can become overwhelming. You may have noticed this in your personal relationships, maybe with friends, spouses, family members. Then in the space of non-connection, the little bitty thing, well, I can't believe that, he made my recipe when I was going to make the recipe, or I can't believe she didn't call me when she called me second. Like these things that are really, really small become insurmountable obstacles. What's happening is there's a space of disconnection. And the nature of this second restorative practice, mediation circles, is how do we restore that space of connection? The mantra for my students is, we don't solve people's problems. We do not solve people's problems. What we do is we create a space for a restoration of connection. And in the space of connection, people sort things out for themselves. And you may have noticed this in your life too, that with friends or family or spouses, loved ones, that when we feel deeply connected, the most trying circumstances in life, the most unbelievable tragedies in life are surmountable in the space of connection. And so the nature of mediation circles is not to solve problems for those in conflict, but it's to restore the connection of those in conflict with the understanding that in the space of connection, they'll figure it out for themselves. And our job then is just to facilitate them figuring that out, coming up with a restorative agreement between them, and then moving on. The third tier of restorative practices are restorative circles. This is where harm has been created, rules have been violated, perhaps even violence has been transacted. And restorative circles are about who created the harm, what harm was created, and what are they going to do to repair the harm? Are they willing to take full responsibility for the harm that was created to others, to themselves, to our learning community? And what are they going to do to repair that harm? And so with these 3 different restorative practices, the community circles, the mediation circles, the restorative circles, and again, all this is on studentledrp.org, that with these 3 different type of practices, this is what we're training students to be able to do. And when students have all these different skill sets, when the challenges they're facing come up, this is the skill set that I would say any human needs to be able to navigate these things. And so that's the nature of the work. I'm not certain, Larissa, does that fully answer the question? What was the question?
Yeah, I think so, because it gives a kind of starting point for maybe those in the elementary level of
that's right.
Elementary, we're talking about elementary level, but like the morning circles, shout out to those elementary teachers and the starting the day with the morning circles.
If now just let students lead it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's a great way to to scaffold, sort of like to build that. So
as it relates to mediation circles, the youngest I've personally trained have been 5th graders. Boss, no problems whatsoever. They just powered through it without any challenge. I was actually asked in the district I'm working with, the 4 high schools, I was actually asked to work with middle schools and elementaries all simultaneously. I said, actually, let's start with high schools because what I really want is once we have the high schoolers trained up and they are running their own program, guess who I want to train the middle schoolers? And then once the middle schoolers are trained up, guess who I want training the elementary students? And so I absolutely believe that this could be done at elementary, middle, and high because you do have this continuum. Now at high school, I think all 3 tiers high schoolers can handle. At middle school, so far my experience is they can handle all 3 tiers. For elementary, probably the only adjustment I'd make is that I definitely rely on elementary students, even second, third graders to run community circles. I feel fairly confident based on my experience that 4th, 5th graders can definitely handle mediation circles. I think you'd have to play it by ear whether you'd ever go into restorative circles with your elementary students. But just that process of students learning how to negotiate conflict with each other as 4th and 5th grade, like honestly, you elementary folks, the people who most want you to take this on is the middle school folks who would love their students to show up at middle school with these tools in their toolbox already. So if you have friends in middle school, they are probably rooting for you at elementary school to start this with your 4th or 5th graders.
Oh, I guarantee you, as a former middle school teacher, if students came in with some of those tools in their toolbox, some of those problems would be eliminated, And so it is all about sort of how can we add these things to their toolbox. I love that. I love that analogy.
Christine, much love to you.
Yes. Okay. So that kind of leads into the idea. A lot of people are asking, like, how do we make this happen? What are some, who trains the students? Like, when do restorative circles happen?
Yeah.
And maybe you have some examples. Maybe not every district's going to be the same. Everyone probably has different schedules and different factors, but maybe talk a little bit about some ideas that, or ways that you have seen it done.
Yeah, so certainly you're absolutely right. It's kind of a fingerprint thing. It's going to be a little bit different for every school based on their norms. So what I'll describe is what I recommend, recognizing that it won't always be that way, and it's okay that it's not always that way because circumstances have to be accounted for. What I recommend, and I'll just focus on high schools. What I recommend for high school is that you train at minimum 10% of your students to be part of the student-led restorative practices team. At minimum 10%, and you'll understand why in a moment. And then my aspiration then is that you structure your master schedule such that every hour of the school day, there is a room somewhere in your building where if anybody walked in and looked in, it would look like some type of study hall is taking place. But really every single one of those students are trained to lead restorative practices, that they've been trained to lead community circles, mediation circles, restorative circles. And that when something pops off that hour, we're not waiting. We don't have to sit in the principal's office waiting for assistant principal to be available. We don't have to wonder, can we handle this immediately? Immediately, there is a place for those students to go to where students will lead the work of de-escalating. Students will lead, do all the paperwork, in fact, necessary to track the situation. If they find it appropriate for a circle, we'll have the circle right there. If they complete the circle and they're done with it, they write up the agreement. They make a plan to come back in 7 days to check in, and then they send the student back to class. That is my ideal scenario, is that every hour of the day, we are never in a position where we're waiting, because some of the research around punishment, like if we're going to rely on punishment as a primary form of behavior modification, understand some of the best research around that suggests that temporal proximity matters. That if little AJ does something that violates the rules and we get around to addressing that a week later, even a day later, or even 3 hours later, that's not at all as impactful as we handled it as close in proximity time-wise as possible. If we could begin to address the situation in the same 15, 30-minute time frame of when the behavior occurred. But that's not the reality. Our retributive system is abundantly slow. And so what happens is little AJ does what he does, and then it'll be another 5 hours before I find out that you're sending me home for 3 days. I'm going to spend 3 days leveling up my Fortnite character and getting really good at Call of Duty. I'm also going to spend that 3 days texting everybody in the class, telling them how much fun I'm having, not having to be at school, and plotting on how I'm going to wreck house when I do get back to school. None of this is particularly beneficial. None of this is actually creating in the hands of little AJ the tools that we want him to have. And so you could absolutely continue with the existing pattern, but just understand the issues that it doesn't account for. And so one of the benefits of deploying this and having at least 10% of your students trained is that ideally that gives you enough students that you have students each hour of the day that are available that can help lead these in near real time so that we can have these conversations. We can de-escalate in reality. One of the other challenges is we recognize, in my last district, we did this analysis to look at tier 4 infractions. We had a 4-tier infraction system. Little AJ cussed somebody out, pushed somebody, punched somebody, used a weapon, hit somebody with a stick. We did a 5-year analysis, and with only one exception, which if you heard about it, you'd be like, yeah, that doesn't count. So essentially, over a 5-year period, we couldn't find examples of a tier 4 infraction that wasn't preceded by what? A tier 3, 2, or what infraction? And so if we can intervene at the point of inception, that we're freed up to do that. The challenge with adult-led retributive behavior or even adult-led restorative behavior is there simply aren't enough adults. There simply aren't. And so there's always going to be a wait list on addressing behavior. But if we're willing to trust the wisdom of our students, when we're willing to train them, then we can actually create a system where things are handled both in a restorative way and in a fairly immediate way. The other question that Patrick asked, I really appreciate all the implementation level questions. And by the way, we'll run out of time. We always do. My invitation would be send all of your questions to the Branching Minds team, and I will gladly take time to come up with a written response that they can then email out to folks or make available. The other big question that you asked is who's doing the training. The ideal scenario is that we get to the point where students are leading most of the training, where students are training adults as well as students are training students. That is the ideal scenario. But it normally takes a pilot process to get there. That's the role that I'm playing in the district that I'm supporting right now. Is I'm part of a 2-year pilot, and that's what I pitched to them when they asked me if I'd come in. I was like, I'm only going to do this for 2 years, and my intention is to have trained enough adults and trained enough students that you all can continue training each other and keeping the work going. It also matters that the work be simple enough that it doesn't require years and years of training to be effective at it. Because, like I said, we want 4th graders to be able to pull this off. That means the training has to be such that any of your students can really manage, and that it's simple enough to execute, that any of them can take it on very quickly. They'll need to practice, and the other piece of that isn't just the training. The real challenge there is when are they going to practice? But if you have students who are in their own class every hour of the day, if there aren't any circles that have come through, if there aren't any behavior challenges they're dealing with, circle up and spend part of that period practicing, so at least they get reps in every single week so they keep their skills up.
Yeah. Well, AJ, I'm sure there's so much more that you could share about all of the restorative practices and circles and student-led restorative things, but we just thank you so much for being here. And yeah, we'll collect those questions and we'll get some more response, because there's lots more technical stuff. I'm sure, their minds are running of like, how do you actually make this possible happen? But Maureen is going to come and kind of give us a little bit of what's next for us. But thank you, AJ. I speak to everyone here at Branching Minds, but we just really appreciate you and your inspiration and lots to noodle on. So
thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, AJ. Man, we were taken to church by AJ this morning. Thank you for that, AJ. Man, what a powerful way to start off the next 2 days. Thank you.